Tonight on KQED Newsroom, we talk about how California is handling a crisis of overdoses from fentanyl and why Governor Newsom vetoed a proposal to create more safe injection sites. Plus, we consider how women voting and running for office will impact the fall elections and the future of the nation with Aimee Allison, the founder of the political advocacy organization She the People. And we gaze at an architectural treasure in the East Bay in this week's Something Beautiful. Coming to you from KQED headquarters in San Francisco this Friday, August 26th, 2022. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. In recent years, overdoses due to fentanyl have become one of the most pressing public health concerns in the United States. The synthetic opioid fentanyl, which is used to treat pain, is much more potent than other painkillers and has made its way into street drugs. According to the San Francisco Chronicle, roughly 1,300 people died from drug overdoses in 2020 and 2021 in San Francisco. That's almost twice the toll of the COVID-19 pandemic in the city. Joining me now to discuss this and some of the week's other top news are San Francisco Chronicle City Hall reporter Trisha Thadani and KQED political reporter Joe Fitzgerald Rodriguez. Thank you both for being here. Trisha, you have covered the opioid crisis in San Francisco for years. So give us a lay of the land. How bad is it?
I mean, the stat, 2 people a day who are dying from overdoses should say enough. And it's been like this for almost 2 years at this point, where since the pandemic hit, we've seen this massive spike in overdoses. And that's mostly been driven by fentanyl, which is an extremely potent opioid. And you know, you walk down the street, down Market Street, down in the Tenderloin, and the human suffering is just unimaginable, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we don't see the people who are silently suffering on their own in their hotel rooms or in their homes. We're just seeing the people on the streets, and that's a lot in of itself.
So one of the ways that was suggested to reduce the harm from this drug was safe injection sites. But this week, Governor Newsom vetoed a bill that would have allowed pilot programs in several cities across California. And so let's read a little of what he had to say when he decided that. He said, the unlimited number of safe injection sites that this bill would authorize, facilities which could exist well into the later part of this decade, could induce a world of unintended consequences. Joe, I'm curious about what those unintended consequences he's talking about might have been. And there's chatter that Newsom's decision to veto this bill may be linked to presidential ambitions and a possible coming political campaign. How is his decision being received?
Yeah, well, here's the thing, is we have seen these safe injection sites, these supervised injection sites, operating in New York City. We've seen them operating elsewhere in the world. The bill's author, State Senator Scott Wiener, has said unintended consequences. We've seen how these work. We've seen how these save lives. Much of the chatter, much of the critique of Newsom has been he's got to keep himself in a safe spot for a potential presidential run. And it's real easy to critique a man who passes something that seems common sense to Californians, to blue California, but may be received completely differently elsewhere in the country. And though Newsom has said, oh no, that's not the case, he's running political ads in Florida.
Right, right. So we've seen him having that national outreach and campaign. What about some of the people here, the elected officials here? I know London Breed, for example, has been supportive of safe injection sites.
Yeah, I mean, this was a priority when she came into office for her. She's been saying this for years, even before she was mayor, that she wanted to open up one of these sites. She said, you know, she was determined to open one of these sites, but was waiting for the state legislation to be signed, because it actually looked like this year that it was going to get signed, because Newsom had signaled some kind of support for this before he was governor.
And there was a lot of hope for this to hit the streets and to ease some of the suffering. I mean, that's what the supporters of this bill have said time and time again. People have been seeing viral videos of kids walking past drug users on the street in the Tenderloin. I mean, if they're using on the street, you have the safe injection sites, they could be using there instead, out of the way of people who are just trying to get around in the neighborhood.
You know, there is also the counter argument, and we see that here in San Francisco too. Earlier this week, a group of mothers gathered at City Hall, right, to protest fentanyl, to protest what is happening in our city streets, but they're not for safe injection sites. They did not want those to go into play.
You know, I was at that rally, and the mothers told really compelling, really deeply heartfelt stories about their own personal experiences with their sons and daughters and people's siblings who were addicted to drugs. And, you know, I can understand it. When you're in that personal scenario, seeing someone use drugs, you want everything you can do to get them to stop. But the people who advocate for this say this gives them more time to turn around. You put them in a safe injection site, we're going to make sure they don't die while they're using drugs, and that gives them more chances to kick the habit.
Yeah. I know even San Francisco's new DA, Brooke Jenkins, is in favor of safe consumption sites. So we'll see where it goes next. I know that some organizations here have said they're going to move ahead anyway.
Yeah, and it's important to note that City Attorney David Chu, who would be responsible for defending the city if there was any sort of federal backlash, he signaled his support to it very strongly once Newsom vetoed that bill, and said that he would fully support if a San Francisco nonprofit moved forward with this.
And it's not like DA Jenkins isn't also approaching things from the other kind of political spectrum of how to handle drugs. She just announced at the beginning of the month harsher penalties for fentanyl dealers. She revoked plea deals for 30 dealers that were given under DA Chesa Boudin. You know, things are happening in that side of the ledger as well.
Okay. Let's turn slightly to another story, although it is linked to fentanyl as well, the homelessness crisis that we have here in San Francisco. Trisha, the San Francisco Chronicle has been putting out a new series. It's called Broken Homes. You've been doing the reporting on this largely, and this reporting is about what is happening with housing for our most vulnerable homeless population, the people here in San Francisco. You just had a new installment that dropped this week, so people can look at that on the San Francisco Chronicle website. Tell us about what your investigations are uncovering.
Yeah, my colleague Joaquin Palomino and I have spent about the last year and a half looking into San Francisco's permanent supportive housing program, which is where the bulk of our homelessness funding goes. And, you know, a lot of political leaders, going all the way back to Gavin Newsom when he was mayor, have put a lot of stock into this housing. But we found that, you know, it's been a lot of short-sighted investments where we've bought these where we've master leased a lot of these buildings, but haven't put the appropriate resources in them to keep them up with basic habitability. So in our first investigation, we found, you know, there's a lot of people who are living amid rats and roaches and falling ceilings and just in really, really poor, inhumane conditions sometimes. And, you know, for the city, it's been a lot of out of sight, out of mind. These are not the people who are living on the streets. They're inside in these dilapidated homes, and there's not much attention on them.
So people can check that out online, SF Chronicle. Joe, this week I want to get to one last story here with you. You were at the sentencing yesterday for Mohamed Nuru, and he is the former San Francisco Public Works Director who has pled guilty to federal fraud charges. How did the sentencing go for him? What was his response? It
was a packed courtroom. There were supporters for Nuru, so many that there was people standing in the aisles just to applaud for him and feel for him. But Nuru was absolutely silent as he received the sentence. The judge compared Nuru's actions, which were taking bribes for city contracts, to the actions of murderers and other violent offenses. He said this was comparable, almost comparable to that in terms of devastation to democracy. It was fascinating. So Nuru only nodded as he received the sentence, but the man was gaunt, far more gaunt than I'd seen him. And importantly, part of the sentence is he has to give up the property he got from the bribes, which is this big ranch that he has in Colusa County, built by contractors who had dealings with the city as a form of bribe, furnished by the contractors, and paid for.
All right. Well, the federal investigation is not done. There will be more to come on that. I know Nuru was sentenced to 7 years in prison. So thank you very much, Joe Fitzgerald Rodriguez with KQED, Trisha Thadani with the San Francisco Chronicle. Today is Women's Equality Day. First passed in 1973, it's a day to celebrate women earning the right to vote 100 years ago. And we have come a long way since then, baby. According to the Center for Women in Politics, there are now about 10 million more women registered to vote than men, and in presidential elections, more women than men have been casting ballots since the 1980s. The number of women running for elected office also continues to grow. So, what does this trend mean for fall elections and for the future of our country? Joining us now to discuss the impact of women in politics is Aimee Allison, founder of She the People. Aimee, thank you for being here today.
My honor, thank you.
So tell us a little bit about what She the People is and how you kicked it off. It's only been around for the last, 3 years or so?
She the People builds political power for women of color. We first and foremost want to understand what this fastest growing, remarkable, critical group of people who are voters and organizers and leaders in this country but have not had their due. We want to understand what we're thinking, what's a priority, what are the hopes and the dreams, because women of color really matter to the future of this country.
And are you a partisan organization?
Well, we're not associated with any political party, but we want to understand women of color are, we advocate for women of color, whether they're like in California, a third of them declined to state and no party, or they're in another party, a working family party or Democratic Party. We're not partisan, but we advocate for women of color and the issues that bind us as a multiracial coalition.
So what is it that you actually do day to day with the organization? How do you help these women?
If you think about American politics, so much of what drives the policies and decisions now start way back in understanding how power is derived. And She the People focuses on building power in the places where it emanates. So first and foremost, candidates need to be able to get through primaries and get elected. But we are in an environment where women of color, above all else, lose in primaries, don't have the funding, don't have the gatekeepers, determining who's electable or not, don't have the other kinds of supports, and it has a very real impact on what is effectively a fifth of the population having a fair representation at every level of government. So we work to build power not only in supporting those who represent our communities, but also in elevating the visibility of women of color voters. Women of color voters, both then when I started it and now, are in many states the majority of Democrats. There's certainly the majority in North Carolina, where there's a key Senate race with Sherry Beasley, in Florida, and this isn't the reality in 2022. Where the American population is shifting and changing. We already know what that looks like in California, but the majority of women in California are women of color, and that is the same case in many of the states that we consider battleground or frontline states. And yet, the political system, the ecosystem I was talking about, and the way that politics and power is determined has, over the history of this country, overlooked or dismissed the importance of women of color vote and women of color's ideas, power, and leadership. So we're moving into a really different space. Think about this. Those who were the firsts who were elected in Congress, women of color, in 2018, people like Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman out of Michigan, first Muslim, and Ilhan Omar out of Michigan. People like Ayanna Pressley, a black woman from Massachusetts, where there'd never been a black woman in Congress representing that state. People like Deb Haaland, who was from New Mexico.
Interior Secretary.
She's now Secretary Haaland. All of these women rode into Congress based on an acknowledgement that we build power differently as women of color.
What does that mean? When you say differently, what is the difference?
Well, if you think about American political system, if we understand history about the way the American political system was built and who gets support, why is it that the halls of power are overwhelmingly male and mostly white, even today? It's because the American political system was built to privilege some over others. And in fact, when we look at Women's Equality Day, and we're celebrating Women's Equality Day, but the 19th Amendment Even the original Constitution, which did not guarantee women the right to vote, the 19th Amendment was supposed to fix that, and yet it only guaranteed the right to vote for white women.
Right.
It wasn't until 1965, almost 60 years ago, that black women and other women of color had a protected, actual practical right to cast their ballot and for that vote to be counted.
So women of color are definitely catching up here. They have not had the same rights as white women, certainly not as white men, for many, many decades. So what is it when you say you're building power differently? What does that look like?
Well, it looks like part of the way that women of color are elected into Congress, have the potential to be in Senate, in our state houses, with the fights that are happening today, means that they have to build coalitions. The one thing that we know for sure is that the way that women of color organize and move in their communities are the ultimate influencers. More than any other group in the American civic life, women of color influence friends and family to go vote, to get involved with their community, to uplift issues from housing to criminal justice reform, other things that we care about, and to really hold that vision. And so when we say women of color are the influencers, they also influence building multiracial coalitions. Why is this important now? When you have a population at every, almost every region, especially in the South and Southwest, here in California too, where there is no majority of anybody, building coalitions on shared sets of values in order to win political power is the way to go. And women of color really know how to do this and have done this effectively. So when we look at some of the remarkable wins that we've had over the last 4 years, it has been based on the ability of women of color to attract and lead a multiracial coalition. And those multiracial coalitions, wherever that they form, serve as the basis for what we really want, which is a multiracial representative democracy. And I say that we use the term democracy, but we're at a moment in 2022 where we're going back to the basics. What is it Americans believe in? What kind of system of government are we willing to fight for? We are in a moment where the very idea of democracy, that one person, one vote, as hard fought as it's been to get to this point, is being challenged. And what we know is that women of color, whether they're in Albany, Georgia, or they're in Miami, Florida, or they're in somewhere in Michigan, where the vote and being able to have your votes counted being challenged, they're the front line. And so the idea that we have a shared value in democracy and having a democracy that really represents us, that's what we see women of color fighting for, and we need that leadership. The whole country needs it right now.
You, in your organization, have been participating in a listening tour. You've gone to talk to women in 10 states, mostly swing states, but also California. What are you hearing from women about their top concerns right now?
Well, here's what we know. Women of color haven't often been listened to. And yet, this is a group of people who lead the nation's most important movements, everything from reproductive justice to raising the minimum wage for everyone. And these are the most effective organizers, as we were talking about. So what we're doing as She the People is to make sure that we are actually listening to people on the ground who are building this country, holding the vision from the ground up. So we have been to not only California, both in Fresno and Los Angeles, but also places like Arizona and Florida, Texas and Wisconsin. And women of color there who this year, and honestly every election year, are going to be the group of people who are the margin of victory for Democrats, whose turnout is often, if we listen to the priorities, then it becomes easier for not only political parties and candidates to understand what's so important to the base, but how to respond and engage women of color becomes then super important for not only Democrats, but people who want to understand where the country is going. So the listening session has uncovered some really interesting things we're hearing.
Are you hearing that the overturn of Roe v. Wade is top of mind? Is that an issue that is going to get people to come out and vote, women of color in particular, or are there other issues?
You know, it's interesting because many people, especially after the Kansas election recently, assume that abortion rights is number one, and it certainly is, you know, a top issue for women of color. Women of color have been advocates. I mean, in office and activism for a long time, including our very own Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who's shown a lot of leadership over the years, even when it wasn't popular to say the word abortion in public policy. But there's other issues too. Bread and butter issues like the economy are very, very important to women of color right now. The cost of food, the cost of housing. Safety is another big one. So when you look at women of color who are the base of the Democratic Party, the most loyal voters of the Democrats, and actually the fastest growing block of voters, it's important to understand where people are at. Safety means something different to women of color. It means protection. It means changing the criminal justice system and policing so that our communities and women feel safe. And so understanding those and be able to communicate out in a report that comes out in a few weeks, I think that's going to be very helpful, not only to people who are on the ballot now, but setting the stage for the elections in 24 and beyond to really make women of color seen and heard in a new way.
What are the races in California that are catching your eye and are of particular interest in this particular group, women of color?
Well, I'm interested in Malia Cohen. Malia's race
for controller.
It's actually, you know, very important when California has ascended to be one of the leading voices to advocate for freedom for women, for reproductive freedom and reproductive justice. Those of us in California are going to be playing an outsized role in being a place, a harbor, a safe harbor for women coming to California for health care and reproductive rights. Malia Cohen and the amount of money and resources around that, she's going to play a key role, and I'm very interested in her race. Shirley Weber's
Secretary of State.
Secretary of State. Yeah. Hers is going to be very important. You know, often people say, look, California, it's a blue state, Democrats have a supermajority, but we also face issues of whole populations. Think of young Latinos and Latinas whose population far outpaces the number of people who are actually voting. We have to have someone who's advocating for more and more creative ways to encourage Californians not only to be eligible to vote, we all get a ballot at home now, which is a really great advance, but to encourage people to actually turn that ballot in so that the reality of California politics is driven by people of different ages and different communities, each having their say.
Aimee, we've been talking about the work that you're doing, and I'm curious about your motivation. What is it that brought you to this work and that keeps you at it day after day?
You know, when I was 17, I joined the Army Reserves, and during boot camp at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, that was the first time I'd been in the South. And it was the first time in my unit of 200 women and that I'd had conversations with women of color, a lot of black women from the South, about how they got there. And some of these women were twice my age. But I always like to think back on my life and say, it was, you know, late at night, on the bunk, sharing stories about our hopes and dreams, that the young version of me first learned about economic justice, because a lot of these women didn't have a lot of choice. Shoot, I was there because I was trying to figure out a way to pay for college. Racial justice. Many of them came to the military looking for a place to be treated you know, fairly and equally, and had a lot of experiences even as young people. And I learned about gender justice. I learned about the fact that people wanted to serve their country And it was the foundation of those that I carried on with the work of She the People, knowing that women, like I was in boot camp with, should have a voice and should be shaping this country for the future. There's millions and millions of us that if we have the voice and we have the vote, we can lead this country forward.
Rooted in early years.
Very, very early years.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
We will let people go to your website, She the People, to learn more about you. Aimee Allison, the founder and president of She the People, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
In the early 1900s, an old East Bay streetcar station was transformed into a labyrinth of fountains, gardens, and stained glass windows. Redesigned by Julia Morgan in 1928 with Moorish and Gothic influences, the Columbarium is the final resting place of blues legend John Lee Hooker, late Raiders owner Al Davis, and others. This week's Something Beautiful is the Chapel of the Chimes in Oakland. I love discovering these new places each week and all of that intricate detail. It was beautiful. That is the end of our show for tonight. You can find KQED Newsroom online or on Twitter, or email us at knr@kqed.org. And you can always reach me on social media at Priya D. Clemens. Thank you, as always, for joining us. We will see you right back here next Friday night. Have a great weekend.